And now we are on to the early Middle Ages, which starts about the 5th century, and this is just as that Western Roman Empire is crumbling and that last very, very young emperor is going to be killed by the Germanic tribes. It's going to last till about the 11th century. Make sure you know that the Middle Ages is also known as the Dark Ages and the Medieval period. So all three are absolutely correct. At the time, this is what Europe looked like. So you had all these kingdoms and empires already formed. Most of them are still around in some form today. It really hasn't changed that much. So these places are as old as 5th century. Now let's look at what the Middle Ages actually is, or are, whichever. It's the period between the Classical Age, that would be the Greek and Roman empires, and the Renaissance, which we will talk about in another unit. Europe was not a good place to be. Completely unstable, very, very, very violent. And we have this problem with these people invading. The three major groups invading are those Germanic tribes, people from Scandinavia, and then Asian tribes. And one of the reasons that it was such a violent time period is because of the foundation of that medieval society and those mixed cultures. So let's look at what we have. We have that Greco-Roman heritage, people that still want to read those texts and those experiments of the ancient Greeks and Romans and live in the light of what the Greco-Roman heritage really meant, the art, the literature. That's the stuff that they were trying to hold on to. Throw into the mix Christianity, which of course you know doesn't go well with the mythological creatures of the Greco-Roman heritage. And on top of that, you've got customs of these Germanic tribes that are completely eclectic. So you've got these three groups that are very different from one another, and then the Germanic tribes themselves who are different from one another, and they just absolutely clash. All of them do. So this is very typical of a European city, to see these different groups going at each other, injured in the streets, wars in the streets, completely normal in a medieval society. So what does the church look like in the medieval ages? It's monasteries that are holding on to that Greco-Roman culture. It's the monks that live within those monasteries that will dedicate truly their entire lives to recording the past history and discoveries of the Greeks and the Romans, rewriting their text just to make sure there's more than one copy in case something happens to the original. And they don't just put them in regular, ordinary looking, boring books. They create something called illuminated text. And so these monks, like this little guy here, will spend their entire day creating books that look very much like this. So it's not just writing, it's artwork, it's pictures, it's floral designs, things that would make this book really alive and beautiful. And then they decided to dip the edges of the pages in gold fleck. That's why they're called illuminated text, because the book seemed to glow with all this gold fleck. You may have seen it in modern times where it's not gold anymore, of course, but many Bibles have that golden edge so that when it's closed, it kind of looks like it's shiny and golden. That's the idea of the illuminated text. That's where it came from, all the way back in the 5th century with these monks. So the church is going to become very, very important in this time period, because the secular or non-religious authorities like kings and queens is declining and the church authority is growing. And it's mostly because this is a time period where they are wrought with violence. And so are you going to seek refuge with a king who doesn't really care about you, or are you going to seek refuge with your church? And so the church becomes the place to go to for peace and for safety. Their churches were not little teeny tiny things either. They were giant monastery type buildings. So this is just your average church. This one was built during the medieval period, and the monks would live in this building. That was their home, and if you needed anything, you would come to them. If you needed to pray, you couldn't pray straight to God. You weren't good enough in this time period, especially if you were a woman. You went to the monk, and the monk would tell God what you wanted to say to him, and then they would come back and say, God said do this, God said do that. if you wanted to have a get together where the village people might be able to find a boyfriend or girlfriend, it was the church that did that. They had picnics that brought the community together. So anything you can think of that's social, not just religious, but social, the church is actually going to be in charge of that during the medieval period. And so as time passes, they get more and more and more powerful, and the ruling elite gets less powerful. And so we've already talked about this. The monks and the parish priest are in charge of everything that you need, whether it's religion or social needs. And missionaries of the Christian faith carried that idea of Christianity and the Latin alphabet to those Germanic tribes, which in turn is going to kind of tear apart the Germanic tribes, because some of these people feel like, hey, there's these guys, these monks, these priests that care about me in a time of such chaos. And so some of these Germanic tribe members will turn to Christianity, which puts a rift between them and the rest of their tribal members. So it's actually going to lead to more chaos. Now, in this time period, if you were a monk or a parish priest, you wanted people to know your identity as it related to the church, not your personal identity. And so you had this haircut that said to the world, I am from the monastery. And so they get this crazy wraparound stripe of hair. Lovely, right? So proof that the church had become more powerful than their political leaders is going to happen in the year 800. And it is because of a man by the name of Charlemagne. Charlemagne is anointed by the Pope as the first Holy Roman Emperor. So here's the deal. People are trying to find comfort in all these changes that are happening. And don't forget, we have the Christians fighting the Roman Greco people, fighting the Germanic tribe people. So if you rename this area where the Byzantine Empire used to exist, if you rename that the Holy Roman Empire, then holy for the religious people, Roman for the Roman Grecos, and then emperor, just to say basically we're in charge of everything. So at least you might not have the Germanic tribes on board with this, but you're going to at least have those two very large groups, the Roman Greco guys and the Christian guys, on board with this because it's holy and it's Roman. Okay, so Charlemagne is the very first Holy Roman Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne was actually a Frank. He was originally a Germanic tribe member. The Franks are Germanic, and his tribe invaded Western Rome in the 400s. They renamed Gaul into Francia, and eventually, it will become France. So where exactly does Charlemagne fit into all this? Why is he allowed to be appointed the first Holy Roman Emperor? Here's what happened. Charlemagne's granddaddy was Charles Martel. Sometimes they called him the Hammer. He was the leader who won at the Battle of Tours. Remember that battle in France, in the town of Tours, that prevented the spread of the Islamic armies into France and backed them off all the way into Spain? That's Charles Martel. He did that. So because of his fame, his son, Pepin the Short, who was not short at all, he was super tall, was made king of the Franks. Pepin and his wife, Bertha Broadfoot, I know that's really funny, had a baby. And guess who the baby is? The baby is Charlemagne. So Charlemagne was actually named for his grandfather, Charles. Get it? See the connection? All right, so what does Charlemagne do that shocks the European world and changes it for a very long time? He allowed, like I said, the Pope to anoint him the Holy Roman Emperor. So in him kneeling down and at the feet of the Pope and allowing the Pope to crown him and the Pope to say, this is what I want, he is officially saying to everybody, the Pope is more powerful than me. Very, very important. The Pope is more powerful than the king. And so after Charlemagne, who will be renamed Charles the Great, does this, he is officially saying the church is more important than your political leaders. Big deal. Very big deal. Now, the age of Charlemagne, wow, the age of Charlemagne was a time when the new empire is going to include most of Western Europe. Look at this giant picture over here. Charlemagne was a good guy. He built roads, he built churches, he built schools, anything to unite the people of his empire, and so they would stop killing each other and things would settle down. Now, he's not going to allow the Roman culture to stay exactly like it was. He's going to reinterpret it or change it forever. He wants it to be something a little less intrusive so that Christians and Greco-Roman people and the Germanic tribes can all start learning to live together. So he was a very beloved man. He was a little bit odd. He had all daughters, no sons, and he refused to ever let them marry. And he thought that they should stay pure forever. So they had a lot of father-daughter time. Their meals were 6-course meals every single night, and the daughters always had to come, and they would sing to their daddy and read poetry to their daddy and crazy stuff like that. Charlemagne loved to dress up, so dinner was very much a dress-up occasion. People from his empire were invited to dinner, so you never knew. Like, you could just randomly get an invite from Charlemagne to come and have dinner at his castle. It wasn't just rich people, so he would just kind of randomly pick people from his empire to, come over and hear the music and hear the poetry and not date his daughters, of course. He was a big eater. He's been known to eat almost an entire lamb by himself at one sitting. Very large man, very loud laugh, but people loved him. His personality was just endearing, and so he was a beloved figure in the empire. So here's how big it's going to get, and you can see a whole bunch of these Germanic tribes that are part of it, the Saxons, the Lombards, all of these people, the Franks, all of these people are Germanic tribes, and he's trying to bring them together instead of being tribes, being a Holy Roman Empire. So how do you organize such a giant area, protect the people within it, and still have time to grow crops, sell goods, protect yourself against invasion? How do you do all of that? Very easy. To Charlemagne it was. He said, we're going to start using feudalism. So what exactly is feudalism? It's actually a political system. A lot of people forget that. But it's a political system where the local government is based on land for loyalty. And we talked a little bit about this when we talked about medieval China. They were practicing it too. The characters in this play, though, were just named different names. So it's all about land for loyalty, and that loyalty may and does come in often in the terms of military assistance. So who's going to own the land in the first place? Think about this. I wonder if you can get it without me telling you. In this time period, who owns all the land? Of course, it's the church. So the church is at the very top, and then the monarch is given land by the Pope and the church. The monarch, in turn, hands land over to the nobles to the knights and the vassals, and so on and so on. So you get to the knights, who will be the actual fighters. Vassals are lesser lords. They're not nobles. They're lesser lords. And so a vassal is not going to go out and fight. A knight is. So a knight gets land from the noble, and when the noble calls on him to go protect himself or the monarch or the church, the knights have to go and do that. So the knights are busy. The vassals are too, because they're lords. Then they have a lot of land to look over. The lower lords still have a lot of responsibility. So all these people under them, the merchants, farmers, craftsmen, peasants, serfs, you can read it. All of these people are living on this tract of land that belongs to the knights and the vassals, and that's when the farming gets done. So these guys are really keeping everything going while the knights are out fighting, and then the lower and upper nobles, the monarch, the pope, and the church are just kind of laying back, taking it easy. So remember, this whole system of feudalism is loyalty for land. I will give you land if you're loyal enough to fight for me. I will let you live on my land if you're a peasant, if you're loyal enough to grow food on my land and let me have it. So it's all land for loyalty. The rest of the people mostly are peasants. This part of land that I told you that they're allowed to live on, they don't own it, they just live on it, that is called a fief. So all the knights and the vassals had fiefs, and it was, I'll show you some pictures in a minute. It is a working mechanism where everything you need is right there on the fief. It's almost like little towns unto themselves. So let's take a look at the peasants before we start looking at the land. So the peasants work the land, and in return, they get protection, shelter, and food. Land loyalty, right? They don't have any rights. They're not really allowed to leave the manor. They're basically slaves. But some of these peasants are a different category. They're serfs. This is different. A serf is bound to the land. They're not slaves. Nobody's going to sell them. Not a peasant or a serf. But here's the unique thing about the serf. If that vassal or lord or knight wants to sell their parcel of land, when they leave, they would take their peasants with them to wherever they move to. The serfs, however, stay behind. The serfs belong to the land, not to the owner of the land. And so the serfs are not allowed to leave. It's not a good life whether you're a peasant or a serf. Basically, the person who owns the land, the person you're growing food for and making goods for, is in control of your life, absolutely. They can come down to the places where these people live on the fief and claim anybody that they want, including young girls, to come back to their castle and live with them and be their concubines. And then the wife of the knight or the vassal has to accept these girls in, and the multiple children that they'll have. So you really lose. They lost all control of their lives. They had to go where they were told, do as they were told, and in exchange they would have a safe place to live. So what exactly does a fief look like? Most of them are pretty big, and they will operate as independent villages. So that operation where you have the baker and the blacksmith and the farmers and the tillers and those that are tending to the flocks and all that stuff, all together becomes known as the manorial system. And that system is where everyone pitches in to make the fief completely, totally self-sufficient. Everybody's got a job. This is really good because invasion had disrupted trade in the towns. And so it was very unsafe to go where large numbers of people congregated, and so people stopped congregating. They decided not to go to town and not to go to city. They didn't need to anyway because they had everything they needed on the fief. Now there is good and bad to that. You have protection. You are isolated. The thought that a Germanic tribe might be able to find your fief was less because you weren't congregating in large numbers, but you never saw other people. There wasn't a lot of opportunity for education or expansion of trade or learning new things. People became very isolated and dependent just on the people who live on that fief. So let me give you a better picture of what a fief actually looks like. So here you see you've got the spring planting, the fallow field, because sometimes they leave a field to rejuvenate for a season. You've got the forest, so you can still have berries and fruits that grow naturally, and the bakehouse, the blacksmith, you see all this. And then the manor house was usually near the center, and it was very, very large. So the castles in the manor the castles were inside the manor, and the whole manor could be sealed up. So if an invasion was taking place, you gather all the people living on the fief and you seal yourselves up in the manor, and it's like a mini town in there. So your whole fief is like a town unto itself. This manor is like a mini version of that. So you can still get things done, you still have food, you still have water, you still have the blacksmith, but it's on a much smaller scale. So you could actually live in the manor for quite a while, hopefully waiting out the bad guys that are on the other side of the wall that want you. So this idea of living in the feudal system became very prominent because invasions and attacks by foreigners was happening nonstop. Everybody wants protection. Hardly anybody is going to live outside of a fief during this time period. The problem is this protection through the manor walls does not always work. One of the reasons it didn't is because of new mechanisms that were built, and this is a trebuchet. It is massive. If you can look at the picture pretty closely, you can see two little guys standing in the background of the picture, and look at them compared to the trebuchet. This is not like you can sneak this sucker up on somebody. They brought them in the open on wheels, wheeled them across the terrain, put it up, near the castle walls, and it was a slingshot that propelled objects as much as 980 feet. So it would go up in the air and over. Didn't matter how tall the wall was. Things were going over that wall. So many of the things that they threw are too sickening for me to tell you about, but on average they would throw giant boulders to try and knock down the castle. Often they did dead animals, sickly dead animals, and so you have this disease that's going to happen pretty quickly. Sometimes they would throw boiling things like boiling lime, which smells really bad and burns really bad. Anything like boiling poo, all kinds of stuff like that, just to gross people out and get them to open the manor door and let the bad guys in. Now, if your trebuchet didn't work and get people to surrender, you could use your battering ram. This too is huge, and it actually has a roof over it. So these guys could come in. Again, it's on wheels. They could come in and be under safety until they actually got to the door of your manor. So this thing is super heavy, made with a sharp metal tip on the end, and they swing it back and forth to knock down the door or the drawbridge. If that doesn't work, you can always use a siege tower. And this siege tower could be used to cross moats. Eventually, some of these castles are going to put up moats to try and keep the bad guys out. But you can see from the picture here on the right-hand side, moats weren't always a problem. So you just climb the little siege tower. Again, you bring this thing in on wheels, and you just climb right up and over the wall. So what are the people on the inside doing to protect themselves? Several things. One of the more popular ones was a drawbridge, and then a little less popular was the portcullis. So let's look at the drawbridge. The drawbridge would be made of wood most often, and it would stand at the front gate, the main gate, and you could raise it up to keep the enemies from coming across it if you had a moat, or you could put it down. So this is what it would have looked like. Easy to raise. And by the way, moats are not always water, and we'll get to that in a minute, but you would still need this drawbridge to go across a dry moat or a wet moat. The other thing they used was a portcullis. So again, this is made of wood, sometimes metal, and often they would make it so that you had to go through like a tunnel type thing if you're a bad guy trying to get in, and they would have a portcullis at either end of this little tunnel, and they could slam them down and trap people in them. And this is what it looks like. So it was made to drop very, very quickly, which meant you could cut people, kill them possibly with the blades of the portcullis. You could trap them in there and from above throw poisonous snakes on them. If you had one that was better sealed, you could drown them. So all kinds of things could happen to the bad guys if they try and enter through the portcullis. Now let's talk about moats. Most of the time when we hear moat, we think water. The problem with that is that when you have a castle surrounded by water, mildew is a really big problem. Things are always damp and icky. People tend to get sick. And so a water moat is not always a really good idea. And they found that out pretty quickly. I know movies always show water moats, but they became pretty rare. Now they want to put it kind of up on a hill, so it's hard to get to anyway. And then if you put some kind of moat around it, it's super hard to get to. And a lot of bad guys just said, forget this. They saw how well it was placed and said, forget it, we can't get through it. So water moat or dry moat like this one, either one is fine, because both would serve as protection. So those the tower that I showed you, the siege tower, probably could not reach across a moat this big. It would collapse. And so there you go. And very often in the dry moats, you could put nasty animals down there like lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, that's much worse than making your way across water. So dry moats became the thing of the day, even though on movies we don't really show that today. Now, the castle as a home was not a great place to be. They were large, they didn't have heat, there was nothing soft on the ground, there were no lights. You had to have torches, which meant that things were dirty from the smoke from the torches. And in order to keep warm, because there is no heating or carpets to keep the cold out, they lived with their animals in the castle. So you slept with the pigs and the cows and the chickens, regardless of who you were. You might be a king. If you have a fief, you're sleeping with the animals. So think how nasty that would be, because the animals aren't going to say, "Excuse me, I need to go out and use the bathroom now." They just do it. So not a very comfortable place at all. We think, oh, I'm going to live in a castle. You would not want to live in a castle in this time period. So it very much is like a wind tunnel. You have to have openings, you have to have air, but very often that the wind was captured in there and turned into like mini hurricanes inside the castle. Very, very cold. Again, no way to warm it up. Dirt floors, nothing fancy, believe me. It does look fun though, right? I mean, I would love to run up and down there. Think of being a kid running up and down those stairs. But still, do I want to live there? Do I want to sleep there? No. So who is exactly doing all this invading that we're talking about in this time period? It's not just Germanic people. There are some other tribal people. The ones that we know the most are the Angles and the Saxons. I know that there's a third group on here, the Jutes. We're not going to talk about them. I just couldn't find a map that didn't have them on it. So the Angles and the Saxons are the ones that will end up invading Britain. Okay, and they are going to come from continental Europe. And you can see the area here. And today, very often, not as much as when I was a kid, but still it's out there. When you fill out forms in America, sometimes instead of saying, your color is your color white, they will have the words Anglo-Saxon. So most white people that came from this part of the world have roots in the Angles or the Saxons, and so white became synonymous with Anglo-Saxon for a long time in America. All right, who else is invading? We have the Magyars invading from Central Asia to Hungary. See them over there right above the Black Sea. Okay, and then we also have a group that you probably have heard of before, the Vikings. Vikings are going to migrate from Scandinavia. They're going to terrorize people, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And then they end up actually resting in Russia. They're used to it being super cold, but things did not grow in Scandinavia and they needed food. So Kiev is one of the major places that they chose to settle. It's still super cold, but there is a warmer season where they could dry food. Not so much in Scandinavia. So I know I'm hitting this really, really fast, but make sure that you know the Angles and the Saxons came from Europe. They invaded England. The Magyars came from Central Asia to invade Hungary, and the Vikings migrated from Scandinavia to invade Russia. Okay, sorry it's so quick, but there's just not a whole lot about this unit that you need to know. So all three groups are going to be super, super different, and even though they're all invading for different reasons, the outcome is the same. It strengthens feudalism. It destroys the cities. It destroys the towns, and it very much does away with the old Roman Empire and the way that people used to live. So rather than being a united, proud, we are Roman, hear us roar, they are these little tiny individual feudalist plots of land, all because of these bad guys. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the Vikings. So their homelands include all the places you see here. Together they are known as Scandinavia, and they were known as very savage people, very warlike. If you know anything about their gods, like Loki, he's probably one of the worst ones. These gods are mean and nasty and play horrible, horrible tricks. And they're created by these Vikings. So if their gods are that awful and wicked, just everything they do is awful and wicked, then you got to kind of get an image of what the Vikings were like. So the Vikings are going to terrorize everybody. They'll end up heading to Russia and settling there, but on the way, they terrorize everybody. And they don't want your land, not till they get to Kiev and Russia. They just want your stuff, and they like to burn things and kill people, and that's just the way the Vikings were. So this is their ships. They were expert sailors. They proudly shown that striped sail so that you knew that they were coming, and they knew that an image of that sail, very Phoenician-like, but in this time period, that sail coming towards your shore meant death and mayhem, and they loved scaring people. So that's why they were so adamant that they be easily spotted. They had great weapons. That was one of their hobbies, to make weapons of torture and death. Woo, what a hobby. So all of these are weapons that were designed and created by Vikings. You've probably seen them before. On TV, very often they show them with horns on their helmets. That is not true. That's actually a cartoonist came up with that, I think in the 1950s, that Vikings had those horns. Not true. So this is a picture of a true Viking helmet, no horns. So the most famous form of all Viking torture, this is just to show you how evil these guys were, is something called the Blood Eagle. And they used this on royalty even. There were a couple British kings that they killed. But a Blood Eagle is they tie you either standing up to a tree or laying down to a tree, and you're facing the tree. Whether you're standing up or laying down, you're facing the tree. They put two very large cuts in your back, and they reach in those cuts and they pull your lungs out your back. And so your lungs this is so disgusting. They pull your lungs out so you look like a bird, and of course it's bloody, and so it becomes known as the Blood Eagle. You can actually live like that for a little while, and when they're done messing with you and playing with you, then they would pour salt on your lungs, which of course instantly shrivels them up. You're dead, and then they would cut your head off and leave your body tied to the tree. Yeah, aren't these people just lovely people? I would not want to have them come over for dinner, that's for sure. So all of this is going to take place in the early Middle Ages. As violent as this is, believe it or not, the late Middle Ages gets even worse. I'm going to tell you stories you'll never forget. So that's it for now for the early Middle Ages. I'll see you later in the late Middle Ages.